How have JT Miller, Tomas Hertl, and Claude Giroux been doing, and are the Wild still interested in acquiring their services? We take a look at each player and what it will cost if the Wild decide to make a deadline trade. All that and more today on Locked on Wild.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen every day. And just as a reminder, Locked on Wild is free and available wherever you listen to podcasts. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we get updated numbers for each of the Wild's biggest trade targets: Claude Giroux, JT Miller, and Tomas Hertl. We look at what the cost could potentially be, and we decide whether or not it would be worthwhile for the Wild to look into each player at the deadline. My name is Seth Topal, host of Locked on Wild, veteran Minnesota sports content producer with over a decade's worth of experience covering your favorite Minnesota teams through thick and thin, and now here with Locked on Wild. Happy to have you along for a Tuesday edition of the show. And we're talking trade again here today. Going to be kind of a running theme for the rest of the week, leading up to the All-Star break. Because we've obviously had some moves with the Jordan Greenway extension and with the announcement that Matt Boldy will be with the Minnesota Wild for the rest of the season. Obviously, we've had some moves that have kind of helped get the wheels in motion for what the team may do at the deadline, if they do anything. I want to start off by saying that I hear the team no trade crew loud and clear, and that is certainly a viable option for the Wild to go with at the deadline. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Plus, with where the Wild are at salary cap wise over the next couple of years, going to need to hang on to assets as much as possible to allow this team to cultivate and grow. And, with the job that Judd Brackett has done with the draft over the last couple of years, I really can't argue with that. But if the Wild are going to make a move, kind of going to steer the show in the direction that they could make a move this year without impacting what's going to happen next year and without majorly impacting the prospect pool for this team. So we'll take a look at these guys and their options. I am going to start with Claude Giroux because we have already dove into what it would potentially take to get Giroux and what he would bring to this team as well. Just wanted to update on what he is doing with Philadelphia in the midst of just a dreadful season. He has 35 points in 41 games. He's winning 60% of his faceoffs. And, you dive into some of the other numbers. His Corsi 4 percentage, 59.3%, which is very good in all situations. It dips a little bit in 5-on-5. It is 52.7 in 5-on-5 close situations, and 5-on-5 tied, it's 50.1. So, some of that can be attributed to the team that the Flyers are, which is to say not great, but did get an interesting nugget, saw an interesting nugget on the Twitter sphere that could lead to a little bit of an idea as to what it would take for Giroux to be a trade target for the Wild. Over at thehockeywriters.com, Rob Couch wrote about 3 potential destinations for Giroux back in January, 2 of them being the Rangers and the Bruins, as was discussed already at the hockeywriters.com. The third, and the one he lists as the best fit, is the Minnesota Wild. Here's more on the fit for the Wild and a potential return that will make Flyers fans feel a little better. Giroux would bring his leadership and experience to an already good group of veterans and along with that, his 85 playoff games and a cup final appearance. The defense in Minnesota is solid, and they will more than likely look to add a forward to the mix before the deadline. Of course, they will have to move some money around, but I'm sure the Flyers would be willing to retain money to get assets back. I think Giroux will cost at least a first-round pick and probably a prospect on top of that. It's a good thing Minnesota has held on to all of their draft picks. Now, interesting note there is it says it will cost the Minnesota Wild a first-round pick. It does not necessarily indicate this coming draft as the first-round pick in which that draft pick would have to come from. It also says a prospect, but I think if you're going to go the Giroux route, I think we can surmise that it will not include the likes of Matt Boldy or Marco Rossi or any of those upper level guys to get that deal done. Obviously, the big hang up there is the salary, which if that report is true, if the Flyers do hang on to some of the money to kind of help the Wild out in that regard, then you're looking at dealing prospects. I think that would be probably B level or below, probably B or C level, depending on what sort of draft pick you attach. And the other things that are appealing here too is it would be strictly for this season. I don't think Giroux would be a player that the Wild would look to sign past this year, so he wouldn't impede the likes of Marco Rossi, who would probably be filling Rossi's spot until next year when Rossi is up with the team, hopefully on a full-time basis. So not impeding anybody in the lineup. And again, with what we've seen from Kevin Fiala and Matt Boldy so far this season, and I'll again not try to throw Freddie Gaudreau under the bus. He's been fine as the center on that line. He's definitely a defense-oriented player as opposed to a little bit more of an offense-oriented player. I think if a move is made, I think there's a real potential to give the Wild two dominant enough lines to where they can really go toe-to-toe with anybody and then put that Eriksson Ek line against an opponent's top line, like your Colorado or Vegas or any one of the Eastern Conference teams, depending on how far things get. With the salary cap, with everything the way that it is, I'm just of the belief that the Wild are like one piece away, especially with what we've seen recently from Capo Kakinen to help stabilize the goalie position. We'll talk about him more in full here later in the week as well. I just am of the belief that they're like one good center on that line away from becoming just this world eater juggernaut that that is capable of doing major damage to the rest of the NHL. They are second in the Western Conference in goals with like 4 games in hand on everybody in the West. They're the second hottest team in the Western Conference behind the Colorado Avalanche, who will evidently never lose again. So all of these things, these opportunities don't come along all that often. And Giroux checks all the boxes. A guy that wins faceoffs, a guy that is offensively going to be able to help Boldy and Fiala really ascend to another dominant line to match Kaprizov, Hartman, and Zuccarello. He's a proven playoff commodity. He has a ton of playoff experience and has gotten to the Stanley Cup final as well. So he knows what it takes, and he can assist the veterans in the locker room to help get the team to that point. Again, it's really, really hard, as much as I advocated for it when we looked at the pros and cons of going all in for the trade deadline. It's really hard for me to sit here and be like, yeah, this team, let's add a piece to add to what is already just a great team this year. But I think that's how much I truly believe that this team is one of those types of deals away from legitimately making a run to the Stanley Cup final. And if they can get past Colorado, if they can get past Vegas, I like the Wild's odds against any team in the Eastern Conference. It's just about what are you going to do to get past Colorado this year. And I think Claude Giroux would be enough of a boost for this team and would not sacrifice the future for a rental for a guy that's going to come in for the rest of the season. I don't think he would sacrifice too much to where you're losing assets that you want to use in the future. So, still my number one target. And, a pick and a prospect and Philly helping out with some of the salary, I think is super doable. And it's going to be somebody that does not factor into your immediate next year plans. So I would like to see it done because, as I've stated over and over, I think this team is that close. So I think I'm going to put Giroux, at least in terms of feasibility, what he can give you, what the commitment is to him. I think that's your top target. And I think that's the guy that Bill Guerin's got to narrow his sights in on as this season continues to try to get that done as much as possible, because Drew's not going. Philly's not doing anything. They're just continuing to lose, and so they're going to start trying to get people out of there and reset. So go get him, and let's just get it done. Let's just give this team a little bit of a boost. I think Drew is the perfect fit. Now there are other names, and apparently this next name that we'll talk about is going to cost both arms and both legs. So we're going to debunk a little bit of what exactly is it going to cost to make JT Miller a member of the Minnesota Wild. We'll talk about his strengths and what he brings to the team and what it would take to get him. All of that coming up next here on Locked On Wild. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before as football continues its march through the playoffs right to the big game in a couple of weeks. BetOnline.net remains the best option for all of your sports, scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just football. BetOnline has up-to-the-minute info on pro and college hoops, the NHL, boxing, UFC, along with live real-time updates of current games. Do not wait to take advantage of all the amazing new offers available for the 2022 season. You can find it all at BetOnline, where the game starts. Continuing today's episode of Locked On Wild. Again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen every day. Doing just a check-in on some of the Wild's top trade targets if the Wild decide that that is the option that they want to go. Again, I hear the Locked On Wild fandom that says, stand pat, don't mortgage the future. I hear you. I validate that logic. I just, as I sit right now, I just think that this team is so close to contending with the likes of Colorado that I'd like to see them do something and give it a go this season. So Claude Giroux, obviously the top target. Another target that has been heavily linked to the Minnesota Wild is Mr. JT Miller. Now, if you ask Canucks fans, and we're not, because I already dealt with that enough on Twitter, I saw suggested that the price, now, JT Miller, not like Claude Giroux, JT Miller not a rental. Miller's rights for next year would go to the Wild as well. So you would have him for the rest of this year, and you'd also have him for next year at something like $5.2 million. So yes, the price is going to be higher than it would be for Claude Giroux. But let's just look at the numbers. And Vancouver's played 43 games this year. Giroux has 44 points, 15 goals, 29 assists. So comparable numbers for JT Miller to Claude Giroux. He also wins faceoffs, 54% of his faceoffs this season in a bunch of attempts. He has almost 700 faceoffs so far this season. So he has taken a ton of them. And you look at some of the other metrics for Miller this year. His Corsi for percentage 54.2 in all categories, 50.5 in 5-on-5, 51.6 in 5-on-5 close, and 51.4 in 5-on-5 tied situations. So slightly above that 50% benchmark for the Corsi 4 metric. And again, Vancouver was awful to start the season. They have rebounded under Bruce Boudreau, but evidently from what was mentioned on zone coverage is apparently Bruce Boudreau has recently called out Miller's efforts in their overtime loss to the Calgary Flames. Now, obviously, that's not a huge thing, and Boudreau is a coach that really has no qualms with calling out players that aren't doing what he would like them to do as a coach. So it's not a huge thing. It might be, just a convenient way to kind of look at like, well, they would probably like to deal him, and maybe now they're kind of getting to the point where they'd just like to move on. So, Miller, as mentioned, is would be under team control beyond this year. He is, an elite scoring option. He is in his age 28 season, so he has a ton of good years in front of him. As Canucks fans on Twitter suggested, the asking price for JT Miller should be Marco Rossi, Matt Boldy, and 2 first-round picks. Let's just stop right there, because that is not even what the Vegas Golden Knights got in return for Jack Eichel. That trade package would probably be enough to acquire Connor McDavid from the Edmonton Oilers. I mean, maybe not enough, but enough that Edmonton would seriously have to consider it. That is just an insane suggestion, and I know it's a fan. It's not from a reputable source. So why am I even talking about it? But just look at the difference between players who have essentially the same numbers this season. JT Miller costing that much for an additional year of team control. Now, I think Miller could probably be done for a first round pick and 2 prospects. What level those prospects are, well, that's something that would have to be figured out. But it's not going to cost you Boldy, Rossi, and 2 first round picks. That's insane. It is, however, substantially more expensive than Claude Giroux. So JT Miller, yes, he helps you out for next season, especially if Kevin Fiala is the player that the Wild end up having to get rid of in the offseason. That's coming tomorrow, by the way. The Fiala Dumba debate. It seems like the Wild are going to have to trade one of those guys, and if Fiala is the guy, maybe you include him in the deal, and then you don't really have to part with anything else other than maybe a pick, maybe a prospect. Either way, that trade feels like you are giving up. You're giving up, one an apple and getting an orange in return, or you're giving up a Granny Smith apple and you're getting a Fuji apple in return. It's all a matter of taste and perspective. I don't think at this point the JT Miller trade really helps if it costs you Fiala to do it. If you can get Miller for prospects and a pick, or picks and a prospect, obviously he would give a similar thing that Claude Giroux would give, a center for Boldy and Fiala that could help those guys out and could turn this team into a juggernaut. Now, I just price wise, I've really kind of cooled on the JT Miller route because there's more of a cost, because his rights next year are factored in. $5.2 million in salaries cap, in a salary cap hit, is going to have to be factored into the equation that the Wild are currently working on. So again, between those two, I still am Team Giroux because there's nothing that has to be factored in next year. Unless for some reason he does well enough that you'd want to re-sign him for a lesser rate, but I think he would probably get more money elsewhere in the offseason. So of those two, I still am of the belief that Giroux is the better option, because he could be, a guy that comes in for the rest of this year and is done. Not to say that Miller's not a great player. It's just cost benefit, all about those economics. How does it fit into next year? Who in the lineup is going to have to be funneled out to make room for JT Miller? Well, it kind of feels like Kevin Fiala has to be part of that trade package, if that's the case. So I'm kind of cool on the JT Miller route. So still Team Claude Giroux here at Locked On Wild. There is another option. There are actually a couple of other options, but there's one that we really haven't discussed. And so we will talk about one of the big free agents set to hit the market. That, of course, is Tomas Hertl. We'll discuss him next here on Locked On Wild. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning like, is your Odyssey an LX or an EX? I don't know. And why wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the only brand that their warehouse happens to carry? You have computers with access to rockauto.com at home and in your pocket. You can save time and money when using Rock Auto. Why choose to spend 30, 50, even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or car dealership? RockAuto.com is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. And RockAuto.com's prices are reliably low for every customer. So head to RockAuto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Make sure to write Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. All at rockauto.com. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. Thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen every day. Thank you for gritting it out with me and battling a little bit of a cold. And so the voice bottomed out through we got through two segments today. So that worked out. But just in closing today, wanted to talk about one of the other names. Now, he hasn't been linked to the Wild as much, but he's going to be a huge hot commodity that could certainly factor into long-term plans if the Wild choose to go that route. That, of course, is Tomas Hertl, who has 22 goals so far this season in 45 games, also 16 assists, 38 total points, is winning faceoffs at a 53.6% clip, and some of the other numbers, his Corsi for percentage in all situations at 51.4%. His 5-on-5 Corsi for percentage is 49.4. In 5-on-5 close situations, it's 49.5. And in 5-on-5 tied situations, it's 47.3. Now, the Sharks have recently kind of gone into the looking towards next year and beyond. So the Tomas Hertl talks are going to heat up in a big way. And Hertl obviously is a center that could be, a piece that a team builds around if that is indeed the route that the Wild go. But if we thought JT Miller had a cost to him, I think Tomas Hertl's would be more. Now, it would obviously be contingent on the team acquiring him, having some sort of assurances that they were going to be able to work out a long-term extension to keep him around. But at the end of the day, I just this is one that yes, Hertl would do some really good things, and I think would be a great piece for the Wild to build around. But this is a situation where I don't think the cost is worth the. I don't think it's worth what it would take to bring him in to have him here for the rest of this year, and I'd have no idea what an extension would look like for Hertl. Are we talking like 4 or 5 years, somewhere around $6 or $7 million a year? If that's the case, I would rather give that to Kevin Fiala. I'd rather give him less than 6 or 7, but if we're going to go into the route of, well, now you have to work out the extension, otherwise you're just giving up an exorbitant amount of assets for a guy who is just going to bolt in free agency. I think this is a situation where I would stand with the contingent of Locked On Wild listeners that are in the camp of, let's just save the assets and not try to really mortgage the future for a chance at a guy who is he's really good, but he also is going to have just a huge price tag. His cap hit right now is $5.62 million in the final year of his deal. Um, he also does have a modified no trade clause. So I don't know if the Wild are on that list of teams. That could be a huge factor as well. But it's going to take some assurances that he would sign with the team in order to make it happen, which would mean that the Sharks would be getting more in return for his services. So if we're ranking them, I'm still going Claude Giroux because it's a short-term grab that you can say goodbye to at the end of the season, hopefully after the Wild have hoisted the Stanley Cup. With a pick and a prospect, not a huge amount to give up for a guy that I think could seriously help this team. But at the end of the day, we have to think about a couple of factors as well. There will be other teams involved in all of these guys. I would assume the Avalanche will be in on the likes of Claude Giroux. Also heard, the likes of the Rangers as well being in on those guys, which means that that a bidding war will probably end up happening for at least one of these guys. And if that's the case, if it does get to where the Wild have to pony up to try to make one of these happen, as much as I would like to see the Wild make that all-in move, if it gets to be a bidding war, I am perfectly fine with Bill Guerin opting to not be part of it and to worry about the greater good, as opposed to putting some of those chips in the middle of the table to try to get something done this year. So again, I hear everybody that's saying let's just hold, let's just keep these assets that we have attained. But if the Wild can get Claude Giroux for a good price, I think that's the way to go. And that is going to wrap up today's episode of Locked On Wild. So now that your first listen of the day is done, make sure you head over to the Locked On NHL Locked On podcast. Locked On experts covering the biggest stories around the NHL every Monday through Friday in less than 30 minutes. Locked On NHL is free and available on all podcast platforms, just like Locked On Wild. We're available whenever you like to listen to your podcast. We're available whenever you listen, wherever you listen as well. Make sure to follow us on social media as well: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. We are available on all of them, keeping you up to date on all things Minnesota Wild, so that if anything happens in the state of hockey, Locked On Wild has you covered, with new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.